Welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series. I'm Virginia Prescott from GPB and your host for these talks. Tonight, James Carroll in conversation about his new book, The Truth at the Heart of the Lie, How the Catholic Church Lost Its Soul. You can purchase the book directly from Acapella Books. There's a link in the chat on your screen. You can also purchase it from the Atlanta History Center's website. There's a link there for Acapella Books. James Carroll is a former priest. He's a longtime Boston Globe columnist and a National Book Award-winning author. He has written extensively about the Catholic Church, among other things, and reported on decades-long sexual clergy sex abuse along with his colleagues on the Globe's Spotlight team. The Truth at the Heart of the Lie argues that a male supremacist clericalism is both the root cause and enabler of the sexual abuse crisis. He traces the historical roots of the secretive, hierarchical, clerical power structure and sexually obsessed theological frameworks. It's also a fearless examination of his own lifelong relationship to the church and a call for reform. James Carroll, I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Virginia, I can't tell you how pleased I am to be with you, and I'm honored to have this conversation with you. And I also want to acknowledge the folks at the Atlanta Center for History. And I also, if you don't mind, want to begin by acknowledging from New England how we've all been carrying you Atlantans in our hearts these days, and acknowledge the reverberation from Colorado now. So I feel compelled to lift up all those who are worried and grieving right now. Not altogether unrelated to my subject, but a very pointed experience we Americans are sharing with you folks in Atlanta.
Well, thank you so much for that. We're glad to have you with us. And as James and I are talking, please do submit your questions. You can use the Q&A feature. It's at the bottom of your screen. And I'm going to try and integrate as many of your questions into the conversation as possible while I'm talking with James. James, last week, the Vatican, of course, issued a responsum to the question of whether or not the church or priests could bless same-sex unions. And the answer was a resounding no, saying, quote, God does not and cannot bless sin. LGBTQ Catholics do see this as backsliding and had hoped for more lenient stance from the Pope Francis. You've been looking at this question so deeply for so long. Where in your mind do you go when you see a news item like this?
Well, Virginia, I'm glad actually you brought that up because it's so relevant to the argument and the cry I make in this book. Whenever the Catholic Church addresses questions having to do with sexuality, the thing to remember is that the real subject is power. The hierarchy of the church is asserting its power over other people, over human beings in a very particular way, over struggling people, over women. So when the Vatican issues a very negative statement about the lives of gay people, as it did last week, the thing to do is look below the surface. And in this instance, is very revealing because remember, Pope Francis is not only the man who entered the papacy by saying, who am I to judge, in response to a question about his attitude toward gay people, but he's also the man whose motto, the title of his book was, the name of God is mercy. Where was the mercy in the declaration last week that declared God cannot bless sin, so we will not bless these people? Papacy, the spirit of the papacy that Pope Francis began with, which tells us a couple of things. One, the impulse to change the church, which I think was on display in the early days of Pope Francis, is being resisted. It's being resisted by a conservative establishment. Alas, it's also being resisted by Pope Francis's own history as a man of the church. He's an old man. He spent his life as a Catholic priest. He's imbued the culture of what I'm calling clericalism. Clericalism is the system of power You could call it a pyramid, Pope on top, bishops arrayed along the side, priests in the middle, lay people, women down below. The structure of clericalism is protecting itself. It's the structure of power that began with the Roman Empire a long time ago, came into the form we know in the Middle Ages with the European invention of monarchy as we know it. And the Catholic Church, the hierarchy, is the last imperial monarchical structure in the West. These people on that pyramid, popes, bishops, priests, many Catholics who accept the terms of that pyramid are fighting to the death against a global impulse to change, beginning with women who've said enough of second-class status in the church, but also including many, many other people, a lot of whom have walked away from the church, and properly, understandably, and many of whom, I would count myself among this group, are still in the church fighting to change it.
Right.
The Vatican statement last week insulting gay people adds to the regular insult of women, the regular insult of couples that want to be responsible for their own sexual intimacy, the church's condemnation of birth control, the ongoing refusal of the church to honor the integrity of female autonomy. All of that was implicit in this assault against gay people. And I am sad, I'm happy to see so much pushback from it. And you've begun our conversation by lifting it up, which is a good example of that.
Well, you open up all of this in the book. Your book argues that this avalanche, the staggering number of clergy sex abuse charges across the globe in the past 20 years, this is not because of a few bad priests, but as you were just speaking to, this profoundly corrupt system that has been exposed by these scandals. But for you, I think there's also a profound loss and dislocation as a lifelong Catholic. And this opens up really at what I think is the beating heart of this book, your memoir of coming up as this, you were called a special boy. They recognized seemingly you were chosen for the priesthood from a very early age. And this is your inquiry into this lifelong relationship to your faith in the church. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind reading, there's a little bit in the book we talked about earlier, what the church meant to your Irish American community growing up. And just set that up for us, if you would, that scene at St. Mary's in Virginia.
I'd be glad to read a bit. I'm an Irish Catholic. I grew up in an Irish American family, devoted Catholics, not overly crazy pious about it, but kind of typically devoted Irish Catholics. My mother was a deep believer, so was my father. I came into my own awareness as a religious person, and the center of our life was the parish. My dad worked for the United States government in Washington, D.C., my mom and dad having grown up in an Irish parish in Chicago. But during the war, World War II, they moved to Washington. And we lived in a suburb of Washington, Alexandria, where the Catholic parish was still heavily influenced by the Irish impulse of American Catholicism. So that's the background for what I'm reading. I'm trying to put into words the precious, beautiful world, not only my faith, but my identity as a person. So indulge me for a minute and I'll read a couple of paragraphs.
Sure.
The parish church located us Irish Americans in space, not only in a country where we were otherwise unsure, but in the universe itself. On our knees before the tabernacle, the gold treasure chest that held the sacred host, or the bank of blue votive lights arrayed at St. Mary's feet, we knew exactly where we were and where we belonged. At the grand moments of deep significance, birth, death, illness, marriage, passage into adulthood, as well as the more mundane yet pointed moments of failure and success. The parish, through its simple sacraments, administered by its priest, assured us that we were not alone. The taste of an unleavened wafer, the sound of a warbling soloist, the aromas of candle wax, stale incense, and altar wine, the male odor of a priest's cassock, the scent of soap on sister, the feel of a tattered bingo card. It all meant home to the Irish in America. Indeed, as I would learn years later, the word parish itself comes from the Greek words meaning near the house. But in addition to space, the parish located us in time, providing a felt sense of history that extended back beyond the rough immigrant arrival on the shores of the New World, beyond the dread old country colonial past, the Irish famine and the Protestant Reformation, all the way back to the glories of Catholic triumph, the Gothic cathedral, 5 proofs of God's existence, illuminated scriptures, tapestries, and Gregorian chant. Such treasures seemed to belong even to laborers and housemaids, to us common people kneeling together in the church.
Just lovely. I think for people who grew up Catholic like me, I'm guessing that there are some here tonight with us, a deeply sensual experience and this connection to something that felt like glory. And for you in the book, you're tracing the rise of clericalism. You call it the 3 legs of clericalism: fear of hell, all male priesthood, celibacy requirement among priests, which seems so far removed in some ways from the scene that you were painting right there of kind of communalness. But this is something that you trace in the book, this kind of evolution of the parallel track between the rise of clericalism and the Holy Roman Empire, from early Christian teaching to the Middle Ages, something you mentioned a little bit earlier, that evolution. There are some foundational texts here. You bring up St. Anselm and St. Augustine. They were instrumental in interpreting the scriptures into early Catholic theology. St. Anselm in particular spent a lot of attention on various forms of suffering in his writing. So how did this change Christian understanding?
Well, first of all, Virginia, let me say what a pleasure it is to be in conversation with a thoughtful reader. I appreciate it. I don't take it for granted.
It's my pleasure.
Well, the word suffering is the key. There was a terrible mistake made in the long history of Christian belief, a flip that occurred. St. Anselm is the pivotal figure. In a nutshell, he believed that God requires human beings to suffer to make up for the sin of Adam and Eve, to pay back, to pay the ransom, to buy our freedom back, to buy God's love back. That's a crude oversimplification, but that's the idea. And St. Anselm, by the way, wrote just as the first crusade took place in the 11th century, when the Pope called the crusade by saying, God wills it. God wills the death of Islam. God wills the death of his only begotten son. God wills your suffering as a penalty for your sin, or the sin of Adam and Eve. This is a terrible reversal, contradiction of what Jesus of Nazareth came to represent out of the Jewish tradition. Because the first words we have from God, looking down at the Hebrews suffering in slavery in Egypt, was, I want to join you in your suffering. And as you flee from Egypt, I'm going to be with you in the desert, in the wilderness. And wherever you go, I will be with you. I do not cause your suffering. I do not choose it or will it. I join you in it. And that impulse of Hebrew belief is deep in the meaning of Jesus Christ, who comes to us out of it. Jesus is God come to us to be with us in suffering. Virginia, if I could speak personally for a minute, I came to this not through theology or through my education, really, but as an altar boy in that Catholic parish, St. Mary's. I was a captain of the altar boys, which meant that I had the privilege of serving the funeral masses on weekdays. I say privilege, funeral masses, but it was a privilege because it meant I got out of school, because the masses were in the late morning of weekdays. So 2 or 3 or 4 weekdays every month, I would be the altar boy in the mass for a funeral. I had never experienced death. I barely knew what death was as a 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old. But soon enough, I got the picture, and I watched grieving families sit in the front pews, undergoing the funeral mass, the word of God addressed to them. And I saw with my own eyes what was happening. God was with them. Jesus was with them in their grief and in their loss. I felt consoled with those grieving families as a 12-year-old boy without knowing anything. That's when I actually went back to ask myself, where did my impulse to become a priest begin? That's where it was. If this is what this religion does for people, I want to be part of doing that. And lo and behold, later, as I grew up and then eventually experienced real suffering and death, witnessed it, that aspect of my faith came to the fore. Now I understand that the church has been in an argument with itself over this question. Does God will suffering and cause it? Or does God join us in it? Not to remove it. He can't remove it because it's part of human life, but to change its meaning. God suffers with us, which changes its meaning. And that's an essential summary of the meaning of our religion. And clericalism, depending on the idea that God is in power over you and you need the priest to change God's mind about you, clericalism is a heretical denial of that basic good news that we have from Jesus.
Well, that is one of the things that struck me about reading your book, that, you even from as a young child, you have a sense of, God as like Jesus, rather, as, your imaginary friend, somebody who is accompanying you, is with you in the world. And then there's this experience of you going through the sacrament of penance, that you did not have feelings of unburdening yourself, but there was inauthenticity and a lack of worthiness. Why? How does that, I think there's a way that sort of connects to your sense of what clericalism is in the Catholic Church and this necessity of having the priest versus your own relationship of God. Can you just talk about that?
It's true. I'm laughing a little bit because it's kind of funny, actually.
Can I also tell you something? In a very unscientific experiment, everybody I've asked in the last 3 days about whether they told lies when they were in penance, in confession, everybody said they lie. Everybody said that they made something up, which is just astounding, myself included.
Well, this powerful structure of clericalism that I'm rejecting and denouncing depends on the idea that God dooms us. God wills it. God wills suffering. And if you aren't exactly what the church tells you to be, you suffer for all eternity, unending time, in fire. The vivid descriptions of what God would do to you. Oh, and by the way, he loves you. I mean, please. And to go to confession as a 7-year-old is to be ushered not into God's love, but into the power of the priest, because the priest sits behind the screen. The priest is the one who is in charge of your being forgiven, being out from under God willing you to go to hell. And all you have to do is admit to the priest all of your sins. And at 7 years old or 8 years old, I remember saying to the nun, like, what? Well, you lied. You disobeyed your parents. You stole. Tell the priest your sins. Okay, I said, I never lied, Virginia. Not that I knew of. Disobey my parents? Steal? What would I steal? But I would go in there dutifully, 7 years old. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I disobeyed my parents. I lied. And there's a little voice in the back of my head, Jimmy, you just told the priest a lie. You didn't sin. I was supposed to say the act of contrition. Oh my God, I am heartily sorry for having offended thee. Not because I dread the loss of heaven and the pains of hell, but because they offend thee, who art all good and deserving of all my love. I would say that. I was required to say it. It was a lie, because the only reason I was sorry was exactly because I dreaded the loss of heaven and the pains of hell. I would come out of confession having been forgiven. And instead of feeling the kind of pure joy of release, that voice in the back of my head would say, you just did it again. What have I got here? I have the psychologically twisted experience of a person being initiated into scrupulous dread of a damning God. Virginia, this is the key to clericalism, because who saves you from the damning God? The priest. When I was a kid, well, when I made my confirmation, I was given a wallet, and in the wallet was a card. And the card said, I am a Catholic. In case of an accident, please call a priest. Lots of Catholics carried this card. You're too young to have carried it. But people of your parents' generation carried it. Why did we have that in our wallet? Because if we were hit by a car and dying on the sidewalk, if a priest would come and pronounce forgiveness over us, we wouldn't go to hell. Virginia, this was not a merciful God who loved us when we were in trouble or suffering. This was a damning God who was invented by the hierarchy of the church as a way of exercising power over the people. It's corrupt, it's deeply wrong. And guess what? Pope Francis arrived on the scene 8 years ago, declaring that that day was over. It had begun to be over with the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s, but the church backed off of that. Francis was bringing that reform back. God is love. God is not damnation. And that's why so many of us Catholics greeted Francis with a great sense of relief and hope.
Well, you were hopeful by his gestures of humility and of mercy as Pope, but he lost you in 2018. How did that happen?
Pope Francis's first job. Did I just call him St. Francis, by the way?
You did. I think you call him Pope, but I'm not sure.
Pope Francis's first job was to dismantle the structures that had been laid bare by the priest sexual abuse scandal. The deep male supremacy, the deep neurosis around sexuality generally, and the culture of clericalism based on all male, all celibate priests. Pope Francis's number one job was to deal with that scandal. He has failed to do it. It came to a climax in 2018. You may remember the Philadelphia grand jury laid bare the scandals of thousands of, well, hundreds of priests and many hundreds of children being abused in Pennsylvania. It took the grand jury to lay it bare. The church wouldn't. In that same summer, 15 US attorney generals opened up investigations into Catholic dioceses around the country. In Germany, in Australia, across the globe, a whole new climax of priest sex abuse was being laid bare. Pope Francis did nothing but routine expressions of sorrow. He didn't do anything to change the structure of church authority that protects priests instead of victims. And that's the summer that I finally recognized that my hope was in vain. And I began this reckoning with a new chapter in my own life as a Catholic. I stopped going to Mass. I could no longer present myself to the priest in business as usual. And I took to the writing of this book to ask the question, how can I possibly stay with this church that refuses to protect children over predator priests? And that's what I wrote this book about. And I come to a conclusion that the clericalism of the church must be resisted in every way. One way to resist it is by walking away from the church. And I understand people who do that. I salute them, really. You know, the second largest population of religious people in America after Catholics, former Catholics.
Really?
Yeah. I salute that impulse. I have a different one. I invite people to join me as an internal exile in the church, fighting it from within, an anti-cleric from within, to resist it, precisely for the sake of rescuing this community of more than 1 billion people all over the planet, for the sake of the future, not just of the church, but of the human species, which needs a reformed, tolerant, committed to the equality of women, pluralistic institution of Catholicism, if the human species is to survive and thrive. So that's the journey I've been on and what I'm coming to now with this book.
I'd love to get to some questions here. Jack asks, so looking at how the church has responded to some of its past transgressions and sins, I think we can use that word. Jack asked, do you feel that the Jesuit plan to make reparations for their participation in the slave trade is a step in the right direction, or is this a public relations move?
I'm myself convinced it's a step in the right direction. It's the beginning of something, not the end. I'd say the Jesuits, even the Jesuits would say that. They're committed to raising $100 million, which seems like a lot of money in terms of the crime and offense that they're redressing. It's not a lot of money. Let's face it. That's a few buildings on a college campus. But it's a very important statement from an institution that is properly, deeply, deeply troubled and ashamed of its own complicity in the crime of slavery. Think of it, the Jesuit order owned human beings in the United States of America. And there was a grotesque instance of the sale of human beings to pay off the bills of Georgetown University. I feel this intensely because I began my life as a college student at Georgetown University. But I admire the Jesuits for taking this step, and I'm sure it will lead to others. And they've taken it in collaboration and communication with the descendants of those very slaves. And they're the ones who are taking the lead here. Reparations is a subject the whole United States of America must take on, obviously, because this country and its economy were built on the backs of enslaved people stolen from Africa and their descendants. And we're privileged to live in a moment, even though it's very painful, of real reckoning with this crime, finally, beginning with the Black Lives Matter movement. And the reparations movement is a key next step of that. So I hope that the Jesuits fulfill what they've begun, but also start a trend as other institutions that benefited from and even participated in the horrible crime of slavery follow suit.
Well, the Catholic Church, as you make point in the book, you just mentioned ex-Catholics, this large growing population. Dioceses have been hollowed out across the country, billions paid out in legal fees or other kinds of restitution. So does the church have the moral authority to insist upon reparations, to correct other social wrongs? I've got another question here. What should the Catholic Church do to provide a moral anchor, uh, I think, in a period that is rank individualistic choice without a rudder? So somebody who clearly feels like we're lost and we need some kind of moral guidance.
It's one of the greatest tragedies, I feel, as a Catholic, that our broad culture is in such a state of crisis, and we're desperately in need of authentic and trustworthy centers of moral reflection. The Catholic Church, Christianity generally, should be one of those. The hierarchy of the Catholic Church has squandered its moral authority, not just over the priestly sex abuse crisis, that's the tip of the iceberg, but over the entire way in which the hierarchy has approached questions of sexual issues over the last 2 generations. The most obvious and blatant example is the hypocrisy around the question of birth control. Mm-hmm. The human beings are undergoing a mutation, a profound change in the meaning of human reproduction. Think of what's coming, the genetic revolution, the ways in which artificial insemination and other new methods of human reproduction are they're with us already, not just on the frontier. Artificial intelligence. What is it to be a human being now? These profoundly important, urgent, critical questions need moral authority. The Catholic Church is nowhere with these. Who would listen to these bishops on such subjects? They're such hypocrites on questions like birth control, homosexuality, abortion too. If they were serious about abortion, they would be advocates of contraception. Let's face it. So the questioner raises a hugely important issue. The church is in no position to lecture anybody. It has a long way to go to recover any semblance of moral authority. It could begin by listening in a very particular way to the voices of women, and by dismantling the structures of the subjugation of women, most obviously embodied in the refusal to ordain women to the priesthood. That may seem like a marginal issue here, but it's not. It's central. Male supremacy, white supremacy is the pivotal crime of the United States of America. Male supremacy is the pivotal crime of the Roman Catholic Church.
Well, you do speak a lot to the contradictions between the church teaching and the lives of real Catholics, actual Catholics. That applies to not just birth control, what you mentioned, using new reproductive techniques, divorce, sex outside of marriage. So your point is that lay Catholics and clerics kind of pretend that these transgressions are not happening. So what effect does that have on how people think of themselves in the world? And what has that allowed, I guess, is the better question.
Well, the culture of Catholic sexuality at the level of the hierarchy is demented. It's not just dysfunctional, it's mad. And it's deeply corrupting of the entire church. Return to the question of birth control. In 1968, when the Catholic world expected the church finally to change its teaching on contraception, the Pope panicked by the movement for democratic reform in the church, and panicked also by the movement among women for full respect as autonomous persons, panicked and condemned birth control yet again. The Catholic people immediately responded to that condemnation by rejecting it, completely rejecting it. The birth rates since 1968 among Catholics demonstrate that. Catholic birth rates are the same as everybody else's birth rates. The Catholic people do not accept the Catholic Church's teaching on birth control, but they pretend to. Nobody makes an issue of it. And priests pretend to teach it, and bishops pretend to enforce it, and popes pretend that it's all being enforced. It's a structure of lies, and it corrupts everybody who's part of it. I wish that the Catholic people would find ways to resolutely and openly reject this teaching, publicly, saying no to it. Actually, privately, they do, because birth rates show that. But bishops and priests should be contradicted on the subject. Gay people are openly declaring their own dignity in the Catholic Church and their own rights in a way that's very powerful, and we can learn from that. I think we all need to be much more direct about this. And let me just lift up a group that is being given a pass here. And I'm talking about the priests. Mm-hmm. The vast population of priests are good people, men of virtue, heroic virtue in many cases. I've depended my whole life on the good priests. The bad priests, the rapists, the predators, a small minority of them. All of the bishops protect the predators, by the way. But the predators are a small minority. That vast population of good priests are silent. Where is their resistance to this structure of corruption, of inhuman inequality among men and women, and of deep sexual neurosis that hurts people? Why aren't the priests raising their voices with power in diocesan groups, national groups, internationally? They know better than anyone how this corrupt system of clericalism is destroying the truth of the gospel.
Well, that is a really good question. We know that after the Spotlight team did their series of reporting on clergy sex abuse, there was pressure for Cardinal Law to step down, the Cardinal of the Diocese of Boston. He was protected by the Vatican, did not. It was parish priests, dozens of parish priests who wrote and insisted that he no longer had a moral authority, that insisted that he step down, and finally pushed him off of his seat. Now, but it's much different to ask somebody to resign or insist that someone resign than to design a system that is free of clerics. So what are you looking for here? Is this abolish the clerics or the priesthood? That could produce a real shudder for some, in a similar way to abolish the police proved to be too radical to people. So how do you reassure those good people and the good and faithful priests that it's going to be okay if you do dismantle the system as it is?
Well, that's a very good question. There are ways to do this. I don't want to go too far into the weeds of this.
Right. There is a lot in the book, obviously, that people can, but I'm just wondering, like, how you would just reassure somebody who is frightened by that prospect of the church that they know being torn apart.
Let me just say that any change we're talking about, married pre changes, go as deep into Christian belief.
James, do you mind starting again? You broke up a little bit right at the beginning there.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Let me just say that these great questions, women, priests, celibacy, sexual teaching, all of these issues that seem so hard to reckon with, none of them go as deep into the Catholic tradition as the Church's teaching on its relationship to the Jewish people. And at the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church renounced an almost 2,000-year-long history of contempt for the Jewish people. That was the single largest change in Catholic theology ever made. It can happen. Why did that happen? It happened because the Holocaust had laid bare the meaning of church anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. That's why the church changed its teaching on Jews and the Jewish people. We're living through an equivalent moment right now when the corruptions of the clerical culture are being laid bare, and the changes must be equivalent in some way. The Pope tomorrow could order, for example, the ordination to the priesthood of married deacons, men in the Catholic Church who are already serving as ministers, as deacons, and they're married. They can do everything a priest can do except say mass and hear confessions and offer the last rites. Tomorrow, the Pope could order those men to be ordained as priests. Immediately, you'd have a married priesthood. Tomorrow, the Pope could admit women into the diaconate, an order of service that is very clearly rooted in the scriptures. Women served as deacons equivalently in the beginning of the church. I'm saying that there are simple ways to do this that build on the tradition that are not that radical. Pope Francis could do it tomorrow. And the Catholic people, including the priests, would welcome these changes. I promise you. They would say, yes, about time. Yes, Protestant denominations have gone through their versions of this revolution over the last generation. 30 or 40 years ago, well, 50 years ago, there were no Episcopal priests who were women. But there are women Episcopal priests all over the place. They're great priests, and people love them. People take it for granted. And young Episcopalians say, what? This is new? It wasn't always like this? Changes like this, rooted in common sense, will be a tremendous affirmation and will be widely accepted. And Pope Francis seemed on track to do it.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Could he do this? I mean, given that there are moves that he makes, and then there seems to be pushback or clapback from the, as somebody says in a question here, the lavender mafia, and the numbers of the homosexual priests. We're talking about, the robed. And by the way, today, Pope Francis, because of the tremendous hit that the Catholic Church their coffers have taken because of COVID, announced a 10% reduction in salary for cardinals and 8% for other members, 3% for lay priests. So, you talked about after Vatican II, there was pushback from the popes that came after John the 23rd. There is going to be pushback. There is a structure, there is a clerical hierarchy that you go into great detail talking about how they got their position and what it means to them to stick behind that. How do you push back on that kind of level of clericalism? And I promise after this, we'll get to more questions from the listeners.
We have the illusion that the Catholic Church is some kind of super special up there institution. It's like the US Senate. Think of the US Senate.
You're talking to Georgia now, James Carroll.
The US Senate, and in the Vatican, the Republicans are in charge of all of the power levels. There are Democrats in the Vatican. Pope Francis, in his heart of hearts, is a Democrat. I don't mean to be so parochial partisan here, but it's an analogy. So the church is not a monolith. When the Pope issued his statement last week, or the Vatican issued the statement sneering at homosexuals, the priests of Germany pushed back and said, we reject this teaching. Just the last few days. The Catholic Church is a big human institution in an argument with itself. It has a right wing, a left wing, and a lot of people in the middle who are afraid and confused. And they need to be mobilized as agents of change. That's my great disappointment in Francis. He was the mobilizer of that great group. For reasons I don't fully know or understand, Francis has been overrun by the right-wing conservative bloc. Francis is an old man. He will be replaced before long. Who knows who will replace him? Mikhail Gorbachev, a humane, reforming, open-minded Soviet leader, a miracle, if ever there was one, was replaced by a Vladimir Putin. Right. So there's no guarantees. The arrival of a Gorbachev did not protect Russia from Vladimir Putin. The arrival of Francis, especially one who, forgive my cruel judgment, loses his nerve will not protect us from the return of a right-wing crypto-fascist pope. We've had them in the past. We can get them again. That's the great issue in the world right today. Will democracy win or will fascism win?
All right, well, I'm going to have to challenge you to speed round a little bit on some of our questions because I definitely want to get to them.
Right.
I love this conversation. I think people who are curious about this are really going to enjoy how deeply James goes into this in the book. Diane asks, how do you deal with the billions of dollars the Vatican controls and the secrecy around their enormous wealth? Everything seems to be for sale in the Catholic Church.
Great question. It's another one of the scandals, the corruptions. Obviously, democratic structures of reform, accountability, transparency, real criminal punishments for people who break the law and are acting unethically. None of those things exist in the Vatican and the machinery that controls church wealth. Let me just return to that word democracy. The Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, was the beginning of the democratic reform of the Catholic Church, the end of medieval monarchy. By democratic reform, I don't necessarily mean a constitution like the US, but I do mean democratic ideas like transparency, accountability, the power belonging to the vast population of people who are in control ultimately of the structures of governance. The corruptions of money, like the corruptions of sex in the church, require this kind of democratic reform so that real accountability, real transparency will mean that crimes are exposed, adjudicated, and punished. That's true of financial crimes. It's true of sexual crimes. And to this day, there are not those structures of accountability, transparency, proper punishment. Francis owns that lack. Mm-hmm. Francis owns that lack because he's had 8 years to put in place new structures of transparency, accountability, and authentic punishment. And it hasn't happened.
All right, terrific question here from Millie. American bishops have advised Catholics not to get the J&J, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I should just fact check here, not all American bishops, some American bishops, because they claim it was derived from fetal stem cell lines, which is not scientifically accurate. The Pope has, for the record, said, it is moral to get the vaccine to preserve life. So your thoughts on that? Millie wants to know.
It's a very important point, very important question. Those bishops who have issued that statement are not concerned about fetal life, human life. They're not concerned. They're concerned about their own power. They are among that really corrupt, power-hungry element of the Catholic hierarchy that uses sexual matters of a range of kinds, of imposing that doom-laden God on a vulnerable Catholic population. The fact that they call on false science and deceptive claims is typical of the way in which that element of the Catholic hierarchy imposes itself across a whole range of questions. And it's very important, the note you just struck, Virginia, that the Vatican doesn't share that point of view. These are also bishops who don't want to give communion to President Biden because President Biden, as an American politician, respects a woman's right to choose. But not all Catholic bishops feel that way. Joe Biden is a particular kind of Catholic. He's a Catholic like many American Catholics who believes in the primacy of conscience, who also believes in the equality of women and the right of women to make their own choices about their bodies. And he's also a devoted Catholic who's clearly serious about his faith. There is no contradiction in this. And the more public Catholics are about their freedom to be such dissenting Catholics from right-wing hierarchies, the better.
Question here from an anonymous attendee. Does the church have something comparable to our own justice system? And I will note that in December, wasn't it that prosecutors swooped down on the Secretariat of State's office at the Holy See? This is the administrative arm to transfer all financial holdings and real estate to another office. So it sounds like there have been some, let's say, attempted prosecutions of people who have misused church funds. I think they were buying properties in London that were donor dollars. So is there something like that?
Well, it's confusing when you talk about the Catholic Church, because there's something called the Holy See,
right,
which is a nation state with its own structure of governance. The Holy See is the center of the worldwide Catholic community. And it's very confusing because do the rules of the Holy See, for example, their corrupt banking practices, which are not transparent and which are commonly accused of being involved with nefarious financial institutions across the borders, that's not the same thing as the way in which finances are handled across the whole Catholic Church. It's confusing, but you can say generally that it all suffers from, as I was saying before, that lack of what we would recognize as basic democratic principles of governance, transparency, accountability, and mandated forms of punishment, all of which boils down to, and this is the most important Catholic reform needed, control of the lay people over the structures of governance. Lay people are on the bottom of that pyramid. Until they're fully participants in the structures of the church, none of this will really change. Right now, what you have is bishops accountable to other bishops.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that the bishops are complicit with one another, which is why they were complicit with the predator priests. Look, if they can't get the protection of children right, do you think they can get dollars and cents right?
Mm.
No, they can't. The protection of children is the tip-off here. And if they're going to continue a system that keeps children vulnerable to predators, you can bet that that system must be changed from top to bottom.
James, I'm wondering if, despite all of the tragedy and loss of life that the global pandemic has brought, has the scale of disruption maybe created an opening for reform? Local masses and parish boundaries have been dissolved on some level by online rites. Even Pope Francis gave the rights to confession without a priest to pass. You can offer your penance directly to God. And we know the Vatican budget has taken a huge hit. What do you think? Is there an opportunity here, especially now?
Well, Virginia, it's a very large and important question. I think we'll all be reckoning with what the pandemic has left us with for a long time. Hopefully soon we'll be able to be safe with each other. Let me just lift up what for me is the most important part of the experience of the pandemic. And it has to do with religion and the way in which religious people have been unable to practice normally their normal ways of practicing their religion across denominations. And that has to do with what I believe is the largest experience of the pandemic across the planet, which is grief. It's grief. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dead Americans who died alone, many of them, died without their loved ones. All of those loved ones, millions, who have unfinished, unresolved feelings of grief. Multiply that by all the dead across the entire planet, and multiply that by all the people who were deprived of the normal rituals of life, whether they're religious or not. Just gathering with friends at a bar to have a toast to good old what's his name. Not even that allowed. Religion came into being in the human story as a way of dealing with death. Human beings are unlike all other animals. We die twice. We die when our body stops functioning, but we also die when we see it coming. And when a loved one of ours dies, it isn't just that loss we're dealing with. We're also dealing with our own mortality. That's what we bring into the space, whether it's a church, a temple, a bar, a park, whatever it is. That's what we bring into it with us. And we all need language, images, poems, music, ways, silence, ways of dealing with this experience. No religion is going to come out of the pandemic the way it was before. My hope is that all religions, but certainly my own, will come out back in touch with that basic idea that I saw as an altar boy at those funerals, which is the meaning of this religion is what's happening right here. God comes to us in our meaning, to give it meaning. And whatever religion comes out of the pandemic, if it's not that, it won't be worth surviving. And in the Catholic Church, that means a final end, I hope, to the God of doom and a real revitalizing of what Pope Francis lifts up as the God of mercy. And if we really lift up the God of mercy, all that other stuff follows: equality for women, end of sexual neurosis as a governing principle, end of clericalism, end of the temptation to fascism, which is about power, a real commitment to pluralism. That's all under the umbrella of the God of mercy. Because as the Gospels kept saying, God, who is God? Where do you see God? You don't see God in church. You don't see God at the altar. You see God wherever human beings are loving one another. And as the pandemic has prevented us from expressing that love, but not from feeling it, we're going to be looking for new ways to do it with each other.
James, I want to leave you with the comment from Ginny. I left the church not attending Mass except with my grandchildren who are being raised Catholic when I sat through a 5-week trial in Seattle with a grade school friend who was abused at our Catholic school and suffered at the hands of this particular order of priests and the diocese again at the trial. Now, many victims have come forward because of his courage, and the church settles. I just want to leave you on that note because I know for you are no longer going to Mass. You are no longer taking communion. Your circumstances for leaving the church very different than Ginny's in some ways. But also, Holy Week is coming up. This is a profound loss for somebody like you who's gone through this their whole life. I just wonder how you feel going into this week, how you're going to celebrate, how you're going to keep that alive in you.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Jenny for lifting up the powerful image of that person who turned victimhood into a demand for acknowledgement and reckoning. I've been talking a lot about grief. I'm a grief-struck person, and I'm in grief for my church. I'm in grief for my practice of my faith. I'm still a Catholic. I insist on it. I'm not going to let these predators or their bishop protectors rip my faith away from me. I'm not going to let my disappointment in Pope Francis become a kind of disappointment in this lifelong source of identity. But I refuse to go on with it in a business as usual fashion. I'm honoring the Mass and its importance by not attending it. I'm demonstrating my faith in the church by refusing to participate publicly in its rituals as a way of demanding change. I'm a conscientious objector. I'm not a deserter. I'm an anti-cleric from within this deeply clerical culture. And I do that because I believe, when I say the church, I mean more than 1 billion human beings who are my brothers and sisters in Catholic faith all over the planet. Teachers, missionaries, medical workers, doing the Lord's work, especially among the poor and dispossessed. The best of the church. They're the church to me. The people of peace and justice. They're the church to me. And if I were to walk away from the Catholic Church, I would be walking away from them. Mm-hmm. And they are the source of my hope. And they are the ones who are keeping the memory and image of Jesus Christ alive. And finally, I believe in the church because that's what the church is for, keeping the memory and image of Jesus Christ alive.
James Carroll, I want to thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. A real pleasure.
Virginia, you've honored me with the depth of your readiness to have this conversation. I appreciate it. And I appreciate all the people who've been with us, especially those of you who ask questions.
Yes, thank you. And we do encourage you to buy a copy of The Truth at the Heart of the Lie from Acapella Books. There's a link at the Atlanta History Center's website. You can also, of course, go to Acapella Books. There are lots more virtual author talks coming up. In fact, next Thursday, April 1st, Andrew Filer is going to be speaking with Shirley Franklin about his new book, A Better Life for Their Children. It is just a gorgeous collection of photographs and stories about the more than 4,000 schools built for African American children across the U.S. Other talks coming up. There's a full schedule and Zoom links at atlantahistorycenter.com. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and enjoy James Carroll's book. It is a rich, there's a lot of acreage in that book to cover, and we thank you for joining us for that tonight. Good night.